This is the I Read Comic Books podcast, and this is a very special episode of the I Read Comic Books podcast because we're talking about a very special book. We are ringing in the new year for this episode. I think this is going to be the first episode of 2020, and we're going to be talking about serial killers. Yeah! In specific, we're going to be talking about a singular book called My Friend Dahmer. It is an original graphic novel written by Derf Backderf. Before we get into anything, I want to say full spoilers for Derf Backderf's My Friend Dahmer. It's a fantastic book. You should all go read it. But I've got two special people here that I'm going to be talking with about this book. That is Paul Jasley.
Hello.
And Nick White.
Hey.
Thank you both for joining me for this amazing special episode. Now, one other thing I need to throw out there. This was a request from our couple years old Kickstarter. One of the people that backed us at a very high tier was like, hey, I never got my request because he forgot about it, and he wanted us to read this book. So Paul and Nick were very easy to convince to sit down and talk about this book. How do you guys feel about one of the most disgusting murderers in American history? Paul, well, Nick, what are your feelings on this book? Let's just dive right into it.
Well, what a way to start off 2020. I'm going to start right there.
New year, new me.
Exactly. No, this is interesting because I had actually read this book a few years ago, I think when it first came out, and I was really struck by it and it stayed in my mind. So it was nice to go back and revisit it and to have it sort of reinforce just what a great bit of cartooning this book really is. I think Derf Backderf's style fits the subject matter in the fact that it's so different and not grim. Does that make sense? So, like, it's interesting to read the book and see that tension between Derf's cartoony style, the grimness of the subject matter. It makes for a really compelling read, despite the fact that it is a really disturbing story about a very disturbing person.
Yeah, what was really interesting, in that regard, is that at no point does Derf go into the grotesqueness of what happens with Jeff Dahmer. Instead, it's about him growing up. Like I should preface that if you haven't read the book, this is about the life of Jeffrey Dahmer from the perspective of Derf Backderf, who went to high school with him, and the time that Derf interacted with him, which was in their late junior high school years into their high school years, before they graduated, and then they parted ways and never saw each other again. But yeah, it is interesting that he's able to tackle this without, I guess, not getting too grotesque, despite the actual story that happened with Jeff while he was in high school. But Nick, what are your opening thoughts on this whole book?
Yeah, I mean, Paul kind of hit the nail on the head about Backderf's art aesthetic, which I find kind of interesting because Backderf, in terms of the subject matter that he chooses to address, he largely, stays away from any of the stuff that would be considered gory or, just really lurid content, right? But that being said, there's something, despite the fact that we're following him in high school where, there are warning signs and things like that, the art style is still very... There's something foreboding about it. There's something kind of exaggerated and grotesque about his features. I think I wrote to you a couple days ago and said it really reminds me of almost the sort of Mad Magazine caricatures that you see, as well as, and maybe Paul knows what this is. Mike didn't know. It reminds me a lot of like Rat Fink.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like Big Daddy Ross's Rat Fink, everyone's a little bit like there's heavy inking and everything looks kind of crazy and grotesque and just unsettling.
Yeah. I feel like there was an era of comics that really pushed on this style, leaned on this style. I feel like you could also look at like Ed Piskor's stuff that he's done. Looks very similar, like in the detail and the heavy inking. My buddy, who I guess I should say the person that told us we got to do this show, my friend Russ, really enjoyed it and wanted us to talk about it. He said he felt a lot of influences from R. Crumb as well as Gilbert Shelton. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Gilbert Shelton's work. It's like old 70s stuff that's kind of in that era of like weird, gross comics. Or at least that's how I see it.
Oh, I didn't know that he was the one who put forth the the edict to make this episode. That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
He was a kind individual who backed us on our Kickstarter and, got his T-shirt and all that stuff and just sat on the request to make the episode. So here we are.
And then after we took a long time to do it, he picked a book about someone who was largely ignored for a long period of time and then killed people. I feel like I'm going to not try to read into that, but I feel like there's some messaging going on there.
Yeah.
So maybe to segue from that point you just made, Nick, I think what makes the book work in a lot of ways is that art style and also Derf's pacing. The opening few pages of the book are just Jeffrey Dahmer walking down a deserted road. Mm-hmm, but the way it's paced, you get that sense of isolation and loneliness that I think Derf points to again and again as saying, this isn't the cause, this isn't the reason why Dahmer did what he did, but to understand that period of time, late 70s, Akron, Ohio, the desolation of the Midwest, post-industrial city like that, and the sort of isolation of the teenage years, Derf captures all that visually without really without stating it. It's all there on the page, and you just kind of get that ominous sense of it. And I think it's masterful how he does that.
Totally.
And I think some people's criticisms of this book, and I think maybe some of them just came in uninformed or felt that it was going to deal with some of the more, like I said, lurid stuff involving Jeffrey Dahmer. Like the fact that he's largely just walking around and, there's not a lot going on there. I think that, as you said, it really just reflects the Midwest and that day and age. There wasn't a whole lot to do, and so if you couldn't make friends, the isolation is there. Yeah, definitely.
And I think an interesting piece of that is Derf's reflection on saying, meanwhile, while I was doing X, which seems like a normal teen thing, Jeff was doing this. And and of course, this is all him digging into like history and hearing interviews with Jeffrey Dahmer and his parents and different things like that. But at the same time, it was clear, like, while I was out just being a band nerd, Jeff was coming to school drinking every day. Right. And like to me, that like is interesting that he's able to, after so many years, find that level of like introspection to say like I had it pretty damn good, and like the fact that this thing happened in the same town, in the same high school, like all of these things lined up, and he draws a lot of parallels to himself and Jeffrey Dahmer in some ways to say, my dad was also a chemist. My dad was also hard-nosed. My dad did this, and my family life was kind of similar to his. The only difference was some unknown factor that Derf doesn't even try to like really point at. I mean, I think there's he does a little bit of opinionating in the beginning of the book, but at the end of the day, he's not trying to say, I solved Jeffrey Dahmer, right. But he does draw a lot of lines to say, it's so strange, there must have been some variable that no one knows and no one will ever know that drove Jeffrey Dahmer to do this. But look at how close my life was compared to his. And Nick, I think you mentioned this to me, when we were chatting about this before the episode. I think Derf is almost trying to like come clean, or like trying to say like, I could have done something, and he wanted to write this story to a certain extent to kind of clear his conscience in some way, to say like not to like say that he could have really done anything, that he felt guilty, but that he was so close to the subject matter, it almost behooves him to actually tell this story so people understood who this person was from a perspective that was very close to him, and not just a series of media interviews and things like that, which again, I want to get into the back matter and like later in the episode, but I think like Derf wrote this to definitely try to just get something out there for his own personal stake, as well as to provide a side of the story that maybe a lot of people didn't see, and I certainly didn't, as someone who's strange and has read some stuff about Jeffrey Dahmer in a curious way. This is definitely a book that like took me and kind of blew my mind. I mean, this is my second reread, and I loved it the second time as much as I did the first.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's interesting because there's a fine line that Derf has to walk here in the fact that he wants to, give a unique perspective on Jeffrey Dahmer that he has. At the same time, he can't be sympathetic, and I think it's a very unsympathetic book. Like there's never an attempt to explain away Jeffrey Dahmer's behavior, or say like, here's why he did it, like you said. But the attempt, I think, of Derf to point out these troubling behaviors, and there's a refrain in the book that he comes back to, says, "Why didn't anyone do anything? Where were the adults?" Is literally a quote from the book. And I remember reading it the first time, and that really struck me because, there were so many warning signs that I think you only see in retrospect. But at the time, it's like, why didn't someone do something? Not that it would have, saved anybody or made any difference, but still, the fact that this went on and you had a troubled teenager who had no one to turn to, it's, at one hand, it's a unique story. On the other hand, it's not unique. How many kids went to that same thing and didn't turn out to be serial killers? There's always that caveat. But again, it's a story that I think a lot of people can relate to on a very human, basic level.
Yeah, I think Derf does a good job of saying that Jeffrey Dahmer is a tragic character until the moment he kills someone.
Exactly.
That was, I actually, on my second time reading, that really hit home for some reason. I like that Derf tries to paint this picture of saying you should feel bad for this guy until the moment he killed someone. Then after that, it should be no sympathy for him at all. Exactly. And it's not even necessarily sympathy so much as it is pity. Yeah. Because even as a kid, he was still being pretty fucking gross. He was still picking up roadkill, and he potentially he never killed anything living until he killed his first person, but or at least according to him, all the claims and stuff like that. But it's not that he was necessarily trying to go down a path of goodness or something. I don't know. I think it's pretty fucked up if you're tearing roadkill apart for fun.
Yeah, exactly. And Derf does make Dahmer out to be a very unsympathetic character. He has no empathy for other people. That's just something that happens throughout the book,
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think Derf is trying to really draw two lines in a way. And I think the first line is to say, yes, it's true. It was, the 1970s. Things were different. Education was different. Public schooling was different. The safety nets in schools and the reporting of people and sort of the way the school tried to keep tabs on its students and whatnot was totally different / non-existent. And so, yes, it was a different time, and that is one thing. But then Derf says, yes, it was a different time, but that doesn't totally explain Jeff, because my life was not the same life Jeff had. Yeah. We were not the same. It was a different time, but Jeff was still, even despite it being a different time, a different era, Jeff was still, even for that point, a very different individual. And I honestly think, and it seems like a no-brainer way, but when you look at this larger-than-life persona you've got in this book, Jeffrey Dahmer, jeez, let me try this again. When you've got this larger-than-life persona in this book of Jeffrey Dahmer, and obviously his name's the title of the book and whatnot, and so there's a focus there, I think when you reframe this as just Derf trying to, and you can see there's almost a back and forth with Derf of how is he supposed to feel? Because a lot of this does feel like sometimes it almost sounds like he seems really regretful for what happened, that he almost feels like he could have done something. And then at other points he says, I was a 16-year-old in high school. I was so caught up in myself, just like every other 16-year-old was. What did you expect of me? I wasn't an adult. The adults weren't doing anything. Right. And so he just seems really, really torn. And I think that I totally understand that, because it wasn't even like Backderf was an individual who was just a simple passive observer at school, right? He wasn't someone who said, I really didn't know him, but gee, I saw him at lunch and he was, being weird, right? Right. It's not just that he was a passive observer. He was someone who was actively interacting and, engaging with Dahmer. And I think exactly. And I think that's what scares him the most, is he feels like he was someone who was perhaps, exacerbating Dahmer's behaviors, egging him on, encouraging him.
I don't necessarily know if that's the case.
Well, I mean, even Backderf says, and I agree with him, he feels like, the things he didn't and couldn't have and wouldn't have changed
Yes.
Jeff.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, right.
But that doesn't change the fact that on some level you're still asking yourself, sitting up in the middle of the night and going, well, still, that doesn't stop me from wondering, right?
Yeah.
So, so it's a really tortured book from that perspective, because like I said, you can see Backderf like kind of all these different emotions that he's feeling about the whole scenario.
Yeah,
playing
go
out.
ahead, Paul. Go ahead.
And I think that's why the book works so well, is in some sense it's almost Derf's story even more than Dahmer's. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that's why I could see someone who wants to know more about Jeffrey Dahmer might be disappointed, because it really does feel like a memoir that Derf is doing, instead of a deep psychological analysis. There is some of that, obviously, but I like that Derf's restraint at times to say, look, I didn't see this behavior. I read about it later on. I can't speak to things I didn't witness firsthand, because it's his story too,
Yeah, I think he took a very professional, objective, take on this book, or he took used that as I can't speak to this. I only have guesses, and especially when we get into the back matter, I highly encourage anyone who gets this in digital format or in physical format to read all of the back matter. It's a lot of text, but I honestly couldn't stop reading it. I was reading this at 2 a.m. on Wednesday before we were recording this, and I just couldn't stop reading the last part of this. Now, I should also say, reading this book at 2 a.m, despite Jeffrey Dahmer being dead and having been dead for 20 years now, I still thought a giant 6.5 foot tall man was going to kill me when I was going to sleep that night. But nonetheless, the back matter in this, I think, is really, really important to say, how did he know this? Why did he put this scene in?
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of scenes where there's no way that Derf could have known this. And it's clear that he even says in some places, I read about this later, but here's how I pictured this thing. And he goes even further into detail on how that, how he said, I read about all this stuff with his mom, and this is why I placed this scene here, or here's how I simplified a scene that happened in real life because I didn't want to crowd the page with 20 bodies, or 20 people. I shouldn't say bodies and like that. 20 living human beings.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to how masterful the book is, I think, visually and narratively. I think Derf is such a nuanced cartoonist, which might not be obvious at first glance, because like we said, his style is idiosyncratic. It's grotesque at times. It's cartoony, in a pejorative sense sometimes. But his narrative pacing is so well done and nuanced at times in the book. It really does capture you in a way that I think the movie adaptation doesn't. I think visually the book works so much better as a comic than it did as a movie.
Yeah, Paul, did you get a chance to read the little ebook exclusive stuff? I don't know if you had this physically or digitally,
no.
where you got to actually. Okay, so at the back of the digital copy, there is a copy of Derf's first attempt at this when he did the 24-page comic that originally kind of inspired this, and you can see scenes pulled out of it, but the pacing is way off. You can tell that it was it's a very rushed thing, because I think even in the foreword, I think Derf says that he really when he heard about this, he needed to get something out, and so he created a series of small little stories that he could remember, and then he eventually went on to do a little mini book that I think maybe won an award or something. But coming back to the full book, you can really see where he stretched out some ideas that really needed some focus, and adding a lot more than what was in the original comic, to make sure that the book is well paced like that. I think you can tell he really spent a lot of time to make sure that this was executed in such a way that it didn't make Jeff seemed like a sympathetic character, making you understand that while all of this stuff is very sad and very tragic, by no means should you feel bad for Jeffrey Dahmer.
Right, exactly.
And I really like that. I like that he spent the amount of time, and there are even pages that you could say in some places where he could have cut panels out or pages out, but without that, you don't get those beats of slight suspense. And I don't think this book by any means is truly suspenseful, but you need some of those breathing moments to see things build visually before the words come in, or before you actually see the final moment of a scene. I really appreciated that about this book.
I think tension is the word I keep coming back to again. There's a tension between the grimness of the subject matter and Derf's style, and there's also a tension in just the pacing and the deliberate sort of slowness of a lot of the scenes that I think it's a masterful book in that regard.
Yeah. The thing about his art is that at first glance, I feel like most people will go, ugh. Like, you'll kind of step back and you'll look at this, and I think, Mad Magazine, Nick, I think you mentioned that, is a great comparison, because I think you would see a lot of these types of caricatures with these they're very realistic but also incredibly cartoony style. But as the book went on, and again, especially on my second read, I really appreciated the level of depth and detail that there's so many line marks in some of these pages that it's like he must have spent days just on this one panel of someone's house because he wanted to make sure that it was accurate. And I really appreciated it again the second time coming through, because as exaggerated and caricaturesque as all of these emotions and all these things that you see are, it really hits home a lot of the strangeness that was definitely Jeffrey Dahmer, given the way that things are described. Like, you had to be exaggerated with this guy, otherwise you weren't going to get that same feeling.
Right, yeah.
But I mean, I guess, did you guys have a moment in the book that you, like, I don't want to say necessarily particularly enjoyed, but was there something that really struck you as super interesting in this book, like a segment or a piece of it?
I mentioned the opening scene with Dahmer walking down the road. I think the way that Derf frames that, you have a bird's eye perspective of someone walking down the road, and not even like a person, just feet. Walking down the road. It's just such a striking way to open the book, because I think, again, if you're just coming to the book based on the title or the subject matter, you might just want to see something over the top, or you want to see something grisly or ghastly. Maybe. But, to open the book that way, I think is a really interesting way to foreshadow the recurring theme of isolation and loneliness that Derf comes back to again and again. So I think that opening scene really works for me. And again, the stuff that Derf does with the jogger, that Dahmer's fantasizing about early in the book, that is done so well. And again, that's a scene that shows up later in the movie adaptation that doesn't work as well as just the way Derf does those scenes of a jogger running down the road the same way Dahmer's walking down the street.
Yeah.
Those images always stuck with me every time I read the book.
Yeah, Nick, what about you? Was there anything in this book that like really struck you as you were reading it?
I mean, I think obviously there's the scene with the skull, I'm not sure of what, that gets placed on a stick or something, and then it gets put on that hill, and it's casting this long, menacing shadow down onto the ground. And I felt that was kind of appropriate because, and again, maybe this is my brain trying to process things, but it seemed like Backderf, when you kept getting shots of Dahmer, the shadows being cast onto his face were just getting progressively darker and darker and darker as the book went on. And I don't think that was an accident. And I'm not so sure this book could have been done in color, to be honest. That's kind of what one of my main takeaways was from that moment. I don't know. I think also there was something kind of like really sad about the scene where I want to say it was maybe like the winter of their senior year or something like that. He's talking about his group of friends and how, and I think everyone has this sort of setup in high school. Like you have your friends that you hang out with at high school, and you have those friends that you hang out with outside of school, but then you have the ones that are just strictly people that you associate with at school, and you're not in any rush to really hang out with outside of school. And they just kind of show the group of friends just sort of driving by Jeff's house as it's just covered in the snow or whatever, and just ignoring him and just leaving him and just driving past. Yeah. And, he mentions it as kind of just like an opportunity missed to try to interact with him. And that was kind of like, that was kind of haunting too.
I think that whole that thing is very harped on in this book. Like, I think Derf makes a point multiple times to say, and me and Mike and Neil got together and Jeff didn't come. Or Mike and Neil and I made plans and I dropped Jeff off and then we went to the movies. Like,
or even when they go to have him have the seizures at the mall, and then after that, like, they all go and hang out afterward and they just immediately drop Jeff off.
Yeah.
And again, like, I want to be super mega clear about this, and I think we've been very crystal clear about this up to this point anyway, but like, the whole point of this book is not Derf saying, geez, the Jeff that the world ended up finding is not the Jeff that I knew, and I don't know how he became that person, and he was so different. Like, Derf is clearly laying out Exhibit A, Exhibit B, Exhibit C. Like, if anything else, he is clearly giving you the clear-cut, evidence of how Jeff became Jeff.
Yeah.
Like, he's not saying, I don't know who this guy is. I don't know how it happened. Like, you should all feel bad. He's saying, I have a file folder that's fucking full of examples and reasons of how this happened.
Yeah. The scenes of, Dahmer chugging, a half pint of vodka before going to school, like, those are really chilling too. And it's not a sympathetic portrayal, but it's Derf saying, like, yeah, why wasn't anyone making a big deal of this at the time? Like, why wasn't this troubling to anybody else?
Yeah, I found that disturbing in some ways, and I think Derf really, he points a finger at, like, authority in some capacity to say, like, why weren't people involved? Of course, but then he also kind of falls back on that and says, oh, it was a different time. And I think he struggles with that intentionally. Like, I think he as a person struggles with that. Like, why didn't someone else step in? Like, it couldn't have been on us dumb 15, 16-year-olds to fix this. Someone else should have noticed, which I thought was really curious. I mean, like, because as much as I want to think back to me being 16, if some adult was in my face trying to, breathe down my neck about stuff, I would have been pissed. But at the same time, like, it seems like there was almost a lack of any kind of security or any kind of discipline in this school, like, in strange ways, despite him showing other people being disciplined. For some reason, no one saw Jeff, and I think that kind of leads into the whole, this is how serial killers in general are. Like, they are extremely charismatic, they have the ability to kind of blend into their surroundings, and they imitate people and all this stuff. And I don't necessarily want to think that Jeff at 16 had serial killer like tendencies, but he definitely was leaning that direction. And as the book goes on, it's clearer and clearer that he got, like, things were darker and darker, and to Nick's point, his face is literally shaded darker and darker as the book goes on, which I didn't catch the first time or second time reading until Nick pointed that out to me. But the thing for me that really, really struck me was the Dahmer fan club section of the book. Not that it was, like, strange, but, like, the fact that, like, this to me feels like the biggest chunk of the book where Derf is trying to say, fuck, like, I was really close to this guy to a certain extent. Like, I was seeing him regularly. I was spending time with him regularly. Like, me and my friends were pulling pranks with this guy. Like, to me, that indicates a bit of closeness to a certain extent. Like, and not to say that they were, in each other's lives and hanging out and all this stuff, but even still, if you're at school goofing around for, 3 or 4 hours a day, that's still a lot of time 5 days a week. Like, I think Derf has this section in the book in there as a way to say, like, yes, I was close with this guy, and I feel really strange about that because I went out of my way to use this guy's strangeness for a bit of fun, and we all thought that it was a big joke. It turns out it wasn't for Jeff. This was him actually, like, feeling accepted by people, and because otherwise he wasn't getting that outside. Like, he finds out later, of course, we all did, that he had a very troubled life, growing up with his parents and stuff like that, and it affected him greatly. And that to me was the most striking part of this book. Like, all the yearbook stuff, all the, like, actual drawings that he had, that Derf was like, this is proof. Like, I'm not just making this shit up. I had notebooks full of this guy that we all thought was really, really funny, and that just blew my mind. Like, first time and second time reading.
They used his drawings in the didn't they use Derf's drawings from when he was a kid as part of they used his drawings of Jeff as a kid in the comic. Right?
Yes. Yeah, there's a couple shots of that.
Creepy. There was something downright chilling about that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about, Derf's attempt to, showcase the loneliness and isolation that Jeffrey Dahmer went through. But again, the name of the book is My Friend Dahmer, right?
Yeah.
He's very clearly struggling with that tension of, as a guy I knew from school and I had a lot of fun with, but at the same time, I really didn't know him or didn't treat him as a friend at the time. But clearly, Dahmer saw it differently,
Well, and I think what's interesting about that is that even in the book, and maybe this is hindsight, maybe whatever, but like a lot of people kept saying, and a lot of throughout this book, I think is, Jeff would go fishing. Like there's that scene where he goes fishing with one of Derf's friends. I think it was Mike. And they catch a fish and he cuts it up and he says, I just wanted to see what it was like on the inside. Like, I think these all add up to, Derf saying, we all realized that there was something weird about Jeff, but we didn't really think about it too much. But obviously they did, to like subconsciously understand that they didn't want to bring Jeff out with them. Like they weren't going to socialize with him outside of school, because there was like they all had intentionally created that barrier. And I think a lot of people did, because while Jeff was fun and entertaining to a certain regard in his quote unquote spaz things that he would do, after the joke is done, these people were like, well, I don't really want to socialize with you other than being in like a piece of entertainment, which is terrible. Like it's terrible to treat kids that way, but also like if you feel creeped out by somebody, by no means do you have to hang out with them. I understand it. Like I think there is a hard line that these kids obviously drew with Jeff, where they were like, well, we'll hang out with you to a certain extent. And the fact that even someone invited Jeff to go fishing says that some people were trying. I think that there were probably dozens of other cases that people just forgot, because you don't think about these things, where they invite, somebody out to say, oh, well, we'll try to hang out with this guy. And it goes weird. And you're like, I'm never going to hang out with that person ever again. Yeah. And I'm guessing that there are probably, like I said, dozens of other stories like that. We just don't know them because, again, you don't remember them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even Derf's way of showcasing his involvement is unsympathetic. This scene where they go to the mall and Jeff has his sort of epic, spastic fit that he throws to entertain them. Derf is not. It doesn't look fun. The way Derf portrays it. Like I kind of feel like he's kind of saying, yeah, this isn't. It was entertaining us at the time, but we're also like shitty like teenagers, it's not fun, and it's not something.
It's underwhelming, and that's on purpose. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
I think the thing that really struck me about that was the way that he describes them getting to the mall, where Jeff's like, he pounded 6 beers in less than 10 minutes, and I felt really uncomfortable with that. Not just because it was 6 beers, but because Jeff was comfortable doing that. That I really liked how that whole thing brought the moment down for him, and then it just got worse and worse and worse as it went on for like 3 hours.
Yeah, and just the way that Derf's able to, in self-reflection, to say like, this isn't a fun, entertaining thing. Like it's kind of sad and pathetic that we did this.
Exactly.
That requires a level of self-reflection that I think permeates the whole book.
Absolutely. Well, I'm flipping through the book right now as I'm thinking about it. I'm looking at some of these scenes of Jeff doing like these spastic movements with his body, and just the way that Derf is able to draw the contorted body of Dahmer in some of these scenes, or just in general, it's very chilling. It's so chilling, like the cocked head and all this weird stuff. Like I can see it in my mind, a real person doing it. You know what I mean? That he draws in such a way that it is very cartoonish, but it's realistic in proportions and scale and things like that, because it's not necessarily a crazy cartoon. It's just terrifying.
And, I've either of you seen the film adaptation? Because maybe we could briefly sort of. I know I brought it up, but yeah.
Yeah, I watched this on a plane because I'm a psycho, and I thought it was an interesting movie, but it was so slow I almost couldn't stand it. Which is interesting, because I think that the comic is very slow, but it entices you. Like my first time and my second time reading it, I couldn't put it down. I had to finish it because it's that compelling of a story. Whereas with the movie, it kind of felt like, did you guys ever see that movie Elephant? That Gus Van Sant did?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, it's about the Columbine shooting, because let's just keep on this path of tragic, horrible things. And it's really slow for a movie that's about a really terrible thing. Yeah. And to me, that the My Friend Dahmer movie adaptation felt the same way. And it felt kind of directionless. Because obviously the story of that Derf tells in this book, it is directionless, because there is no necessarily like beginning, middle, end. It's like it's an autobio comic that kind of tells two perspectives. But you can't really do that with a movie and have it be compelling. And not to say that it should have been action-packed and Jeff should have been killing people left and right, but I think there's a way to do a film about this, about a subject matter like this, and keep it like keep the pace moving. And to me, I felt the movie was just really slow and it was hard to watch because there was a lot of very silent moments that don't translate well into film for me, at least.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's what I remember. The comic is so well paced and deliberately paced that gets lost in the translation to film, and also the way that Derf's able to sort of exaggerate features and characteristics. Obviously, you can't do that in a live action film. So,
hey, I saw Battle Angel Alita, man. You can totally do it.
Okay. But you know what I'm saying? Like, I think putting a more human face made it tougher to process what Derf was saying with the material. Totally. And also, you know, I think what was lost for people that hadn't read the comic, who only saw the film, again, it's Derf's story as much as it is Dahmer's, and I think that aspect was missing from the film as well. So,
interesting.
I think the book works so much better. It's a comic that works because it's a comic, you know.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's sense. Like with the comic style, there is like a layer of removal of. I guess like humanity in a certain regards. Like you don't see these cartoon characters as people holistically. Like you understand that they are, but when you see a film, like that's a person's face attached to a thing, and I want to sympathize with a person on screen when they're being portrayed tragically, and that made me feel really uncomfortable with the movie because it's fucking Jeffrey Dahmer. Exactly. Like you don't feel bad for that guy. You should not. And Derf harping on it. And not to say that it's in every other page, but Derf saying it in the book helps. I think reminding you should not feel bad for this guy, but this stuff was really sad. Yeah. And I appreciated that, but you can't like have a disclaimer at the beginning of a movie that says like, don't feel sympathy for this guy that we're about to portray very tragically.
Exactly.
And I don't know. I felt like the movie it didn't capture the same spirit because it is so... Like, it had the potential to be so relatable, but, like, you have this cognitive dissonance where you're like, I know I shouldn't, and yet I do, but I don't want to, and why am I even watching this?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mean to completely shit on the movie, but, I didn't really enjoy it, so...
No, I think the book works so much better. You know, the things that I like about the comic just didn't make it onto the screen, you know?
Yeah,
so,
totally. Well, I don't know, Nick. Do you have any final thoughts on this? I know you said you hadn't seen the film, so I was curious if you had any last tidbits about the book. Maybe we can dig into some of the back matter because that was something you pointed out to me. You were like, make sure you read this. Paul, I don't know how far you went into a lot of the prose portions of the back matter that was there.
Yeah. But when I first read it,
Nick, do you have any highlights out of there that you wanted to point out?
Well, I mean, I think. And I know that the three of us are always interested in process as part of constructing a graphic novel. And the one thought that kept crossing my mind as I read this book was that there were a lot of scenes where Derf was not witness to something, right? That and in many scenes we were shown things where nobody was witness to something, right? And so, like the trust but verify, you know, Nick White mantra, right, was very much like, is this scene real? Was this scene constructed because thematically it gels with what Derf does know? Where's the, you know, where does the truth lie, right?
Sure.
And so, I certainly, as I went through the book, I kept thinking to myself, geez, you know, maybe this would be helped by having a bunch of editor's notes. But then I thought to myself, like, I really appreciate that Derf didn't go, you know what, I'm going to clutter my book. It's not a prose book, but I'm going to clutter my book with footnotes and endnotes and things like this and citations and just litter the page, right? I appreciate that he didn't do that. You know, he understood the medium he was working with and he didn't do that. But of course, like I said, for someone like me, I was thinking, okay, so show your work. Like I'm very curious to see, you know, where this plays out. And so I really enjoyed the fact that Derf had a very, very meticulously plotted set of notes that explained everything, that explained where he heard about certain things or who was witness to certain things, or in terms of things where there were no witnesses, we find out that, okay, Jeff had been interviewed and he said, the fetal pig incident was one of the moments where I was like, okay, so how does anyone know about this?
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, the last 22 pages of the book are, like, after, I think, page number 199 starts the beginning of all the sources, and it goes to 221, at least in the digital copy, and he walks through, like, all of the major pages of this that basically describe where he got all of his sourced information. Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, it provides supplemental information or can be kind of enlightening or provide extra details. And I really appreciated that. I found that very helpful, and it made me kind of relax a little bit from the fact that as I was reading the book, I was kind of like, okay, but like, how do you know this? And as he does mention in those notes, in a couple spots, he did thematically, change things a little bit or edit things. I think he mentions such small things as when he gets pulled over towards the end of the book, it was technically one cop who pulled up and then a second cop drove up later for backup, and he just puts them in the same car because he doesn't want to draw as much on the page. And and again, that seems inconsequential, but like, obviously you can reach a slippery slope sometimes of like, okay, like, when am I changing or altering or editing things to a point where it's, detrimental? And so I appreciate that there was that level of documentation.
I think it speaks to a recurring thing about Derf's approach here, is that there's an attempt at an absolute honesty. It's not, there's no rose-colored glasses. There's no, hindsight. It's just, here's all on the table, as it is, as it was. That level of honesty, I think, it permeates the rest of the book as well.
Yeah, Paul, did you get a chance to go through a lot of the back matter on this?
I remember the first time I read the book, I skimmed through a lot of it, but now on my second reread, I'm going to dive in and kind of go basically page by page, as he does in the back matter there. Yeah.
I genuinely enjoyed it my second time around. Like, I think the first time I skimmed it because I was like, oh, fuck, man, this is a lot of writing. But I was really trying to dig into this, and I liked just the level of detail he went into. Like, there was some sections in here where maybe something could have been finished with like a half a paragraph footnote, but instead he goes in really deep to explain all of the complicated pieces that go into how he made a conclusion for a couple of pages. Like, he explains in detail like how far he went in to try to make things feel as accurate as possible. And to me, I didn't even, while reading the book, think that he even needed to do that. But maybe that's the combination of the way that he wrote it, and then he drew it and portrayed it in the story because of that research. Like some of the stuff where he talks about distances and how far people had to travel, and you see that I'm walking on on the street that didn't have any sidewalks, and he describes how at the time back in the 70s there were no sidewalks. Everyone drove or took the bus everywhere, and here's why Jeff, even in his senior year, was still taking a bus because most people didn't have cars, or even if they did, they didn't drive them to school, or some people didn't. I just really appreciate a lot of the detail in the back of this book. So if you do pick this book up, anybody out there who's still listening 45 minutes in, I really hope that you go through and read all the back matter. The one other thing, Nick, I think you and I were the two that read it in ebook format. The thing that I thought was really interesting was the ebook exclusive stuff where there were some extra scenes that were drawn. Like in the digital copy, he says at the bottom of some sections of the page, deleted scene on page 235 or something like that. And so we got to see a couple little small motifs of Dahmer like drinking during school, and how later years people had told him, oh well, everyone walked around with a styrofoam cup, and Jeff did too, but his was filled with scotch, and somehow no one noticed. But here's an example of one time when someone almost caught him, and Jeff, instead of like taking a suspension, went and got literally paddled by their assistant principal in order to just get by. And they said, oh, don't do it again, despite Jeff drinking actual hard liquor on campus. Like, it was that's the like state of mind, or that's like the sign of the times, I guess, of where things were. It's like, oh, you were drinking once, NBD. But this is also the same school that had like a smoking section. My question is, when are we going to bring back smoking sections for vapors? Like, come on.
God.
But I really liked the way that he went into some of these scenes, and some of them aren't finished, like they're just pencils and some light inks. But yeah, like there's a scene where Jeff went and apparently tried to go dig up a dead body at a cemetery during the winter, but couldn't get into the ground because it was frozen solid. And he did a small little clip of that, as well as some of the stuff from his original comic. The ebook version is very well done, I will say. There's a lot of really cool, interesting back matter stuff, especially like actual pictures that he scanned in that he talked about in the book but didn't make it into the final cut, such as the yearbook cover that he wanted to create that had Jeff Dahmer in the fucking picture, you know, because they were they were called the Paul Revere School or whatever, and so there was a photo of Paul Revere, but Jeffrey Dahmer's also one of the drummers in this little band. It's bizarre. It's bizarre, the actual like level of stuff that we're seeing. I mean, we already talked about this, that Backderf actually had some, like, all these drawings, or a handful of drawings still, that he found at his parents' house or something, that still actually contained things that he had drawn of Jeffrey Dahmer. It's terrifying. Terrifying.
Yeah, definitely.
So I don't know. Do you guys have any final thoughts about this book? I mean, it sounds to me like we all recommend it, but
no, I think it's something that, you know, it's morbid curiosity might drive you to pick it up, but the level of craft and style that Derf brings to the material makes it a compelling read. You know, so even if maybe you're squeamish and don't want to read something about a serial killer, I think it's worth reading as a work of comic book art. It's a mesmerizing work in that regard, so it's worth your attention either way.
Yeah. I mean, and really, it's not that necessarily a grotesque book, because it doesn't go into the gore and details of what Dahmer actually did. It's about his life growing up, and that's still some very, I guess, tension-building stuff, to use your phrase.
It's disturbing, but not in the way you might expect based on, you know, the subject matter. So, yeah.
Totally. What about you, Nick? Any final thoughts on this? Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, as kind of what's already been discussed, if you're thinking about picking this book up because you want to delve into that really dark content, I think that obviously this is not what this book is about, and thankfully, because I think Derf has a very unique perspective on all of it, and it's a real tough tightrope, I think, to walk in terms of how to properly voice and pace and structure this book. And I think he nailed it. And I think that that's probably, I mean, it's a real difficult feat to pull off. And so in the respects of him, you know, doing it, I think it's definitely worth reading. Beyond that, just in terms of form and craft, it's, you know, a wonderfully paced book, I think, if anything else. You keep reading, but you're not, you know, continuing to read because you're waiting for like the next lurid detail or whatever, because that's not here. You just keep reading because I think Derf really understands when to not draw out something for too long. Like when something's, you know, when something's done, you know, he'll just fast forward to the next year or something like that. Or he knows how to really show this progression of this character. So,
It's quite a book. Yeah. I mean, it's quite honestly one of the better graphic novels that I'm happy to own. So, you know, I want to thank you guys for your time today. This is a great episode. Thank you, Russ, for telling us we had to read this, and I hope everyone reads this to start 2020. Let's get this going. Happy New Year, everybody.
Good God.
But as always, you know, you can follow us all on Twitter. You can follow the show at IRCB Podcast. You can follow Paul at Oh Hi Paulie. You can follow Nick at Death Star Plans. You can follow me at Mike Rappin. It's, you know, we also have an Instagram. If you're into that, we've got that too. Don't forget, we have a Goodreads group you can check out. We read stuff like this all the time on our Goodreads. It's it's ircbpodcast.com/Goodreads. Our website is ircbpodcast.com, where we've got our zines, merch, all sorts of other fun stuff. You can email us at ircbpodcast@gmail.com. Make sure you subscribe to us on Patreon if you're not already subscribed. We love all of you Patreon people. You're amazing. We have a Discord where we hang out with people. Infinity Shred does all of our music. They're the best band in the universe. Xander's a wizard. He's an editor. He's the coolest guy in the universe. everyone should make it their goal for 2020 to give him a high five in some capacity. So I want to say thank you to Paul and Nick for being on the show this week, and thank you, Russ, for suggesting that we read this. Thank you to everyone out there for listening, and until next time, comics are good, and so are you.